Welcome to the Hank Cisco Show. My name's John Doyle. I'm standing in for Hank today. He's a little under the weather. He's had an operation recently. This show is probably airing weeks and weeks after that happened. We just want to let you know we're all keeping our thoughts and prayers out there for Hank so that he has a quick and healthy recovery. But today we have the luxury of having Dr. VERGHESE with us to talk about memory, Alzheimer's, and some things about memory treatment. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to dig into this topic. It's a personal topic for me. I know it's a personal topic for Hank, and we're going to see if we can come up with some interesting answers and help you folks out. So welcome, Dr. VERGHESE. Thanks so much.
Hey, John. Hi.
So I want to start out by asking you just to tell us a little bit about sort of your facility, just to give us a frame of reference as to where you are, where you're located, that kind of information.
Well, I'm what is called a physician scientist or a clinical neuroscientist. My background is in psychiatry and neurology, so a brain doctor. I have advanced training in what is called drug development or psychopharmacology. Excuse me. So we help to do the trials that bring new medicines to the marketplace. So we are called Keystone Clinical Studies, and we are out, Audubon Trooper.
Great.
We are off Trooper Road near the big Walmart.
Great, and if people wanted to be in contact with you, there's a phone number
There's
right
a phone
below
number.
you right
Yep,
now.
they can call that number.
That's great.
So we are one of only 120 sites in the whole country that actually does research to bring new medicines to the field for Alzheimer's disease. The good news is that we have a lot of new medicines that hold the promise of preventing Alzheimer's dementia.
That's great. And you talked to me about the fact that we're really lucky to have a local facility, since the majority of these are in California and Florida. Is that correct?
It's true. There's pathetically few research sites and doctors doing this kind of work. Globally, there's probably 600 sites doing this work. So if you think of a population of 7 billion people,
right,
there's one site for about 1.3 billion people.
Right, and that's terrifying.
That's really scary, which is why I feel a sense of mission, and I appreciate you and the Hank Cisco Show for allowing me to bring this message to our public that there are things we can do about this disease, and when science and the community collaborate and we work together, we can bring new treatments.
That's great. So I think a great thing for us to start with would be to talk just briefly about what are the first symptoms of Alzheimer's disease.
Yes. As we get older, our bodies and our minds slow down, and it's very easy to kind of confuse early Alzheimer's disease with normal aging.
Right.
What is called the senior moment. We all have that time when you think, who is the guy who wrote that song, "You Look Wonderful Tonight"?
Right.
Happened to me recently. Then after a little bit, you remember, oh yes, Eric Clapton.
Right.
So it's not unusual to forget a name or a fact or can bring something to mind. A lot of people will tell you they go to a room and forget why they are there.
Right.
Or with iPhones, which are so distracting, we pick up the phone to do something, you see something else and you go off. So that kind of, everyday forgetfulness is normal. What happens in Alzheimer's disease is that there is an abnormal protein that collects in your brain, which is really a toxic substance. It is poisonous to the brain, and it slowly destroys the brain over 10 to 15 years that it accumulates. Once you get to the stage of what is called dementia, it's too late. Okay. So what we want to do is to catch it in the early stage. The most important symptom for early Alzheimer's disease is short-term memory problems.
Okay.
Forgetting things that just happened.
Okay.
So let me give you some examples. I have a patient in one of my studies. He drives the car and his wife gives him directions. So she says, I'll tell him turn left at the next traffic light. By the time we get there, he forgets whether it's left or right.
Right.
I mean, he can do everything else. He can drive. He's a professor of informatics. He can talk about almost anything, but he can't tell you what he had for breakfast or what happened yesterday. So they have an appearance of being okay because old memories are still there and they can talk about their job and their profession. They just forget what happened recently. So keeping appointments, remembering things that need to be done, asking the same question again and again. A lot of spouses will tell you that he drives me nuts, because I'll tell him we're having dinner at the Joneses. 5 minutes later he'll say, what are we doing for dinner? We're having dinner at the Joneses. So, or telling the same story again, come and tell you something and then come back again and tell you as though it never happened. So these are all examples of short-term memory problems. Some of my patients talk about some more subtle symptoms, like if there's a multi-person conversation going, by the time it gets to the third or fourth person, they forget what is being discussed because they can't hold it in their head. Or if they're watching a movie or reading a book, they lose the thread because that's all new learning, right? You've never come across it before. So forgetting recent events is the hallmark of early Alzheimer's disease.
And we might make a distinction between distraction and forgetting too, right? So if I'm in a conversation and my cell phone rings and it disrupts my train of thought, when I return to it, that cell phone may have pulled too much of my attention away in that moment, but the event, forgetting that event or forgetting what I had started to talk about would be something I should at least have as a red flag.
Absolutely.
That's great.
And we are living in an increasingly distractible world. They say our attention span is just 40 seconds now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's all because of iPhones and smartphones. But a pattern of worsening, distractibility, yes, we all have it, but if it is steadily getting worse, then you have to ask yourself, is this mild cognitive impairment? Typically, it affects people after the age of 50.
Great. Yeah, from being a school teacher, during the day, I'll give the same lesson 4 times in a row. And sure, I forget something I'm supposed to say in that lesson, but then I remember I forgot it. Is that covering for that?
Actually, that is a hallmark of normalcy in a sense.
Great. That's
remembering that you forgot.
Great.
In fact, when many of my patients come and sit in front of me, I'm in that very uncomfortable position of asking them, can you tell me what you forget?
Right, great.
Which is why it's very important to have a family member there who can give you that sense of reality. We were talking earlier about, our own parents' generation, how one person has Alzheimer's disease and the other person covers for them. And we don't see how bad it is.
Yeah, that experience for me, my father says to me as he's about to pass away, Jack, you need to be ready to take care of your mom because she's much farther along than we thought. And when I go to the neurologist shares that they have things that may be able to help a little, but it's too late in a way for that help. And so, that covering, as much as it was a kindness in the daily experience, it turned out not to be a kindness in the long term because she may have gone past what could have been calling you and coming in for a screening and getting some, at least part of a trial that might have helped.
Well, you're right. I mean, your parents' example, and I'll share that my own mom died of Alzheimer's disease. So for me, this is personal and scientific, and it's a tremendous social responsibility, I think, because we have so many people who are getting older as we speak, and this neighborhood of ours is getting much grayer than the rest of the state. In fact, I think Pennsylvania is the 6th grayest state in the country. So we have the 6th oldest population out here. So what you're talking about really is the way we as a society and the medical world looked at Alzheimer's disease, and that was with an air of helplessness, that we could do nothing. But thanks to a lot of science and research, the paradigm is shifting. When I went to medical school, and for many years after that, we were taught that the only way to diagnose this definitively is on autopsy. Now there are PET scans you can do to see the amyloid in the brain. And most importantly, and the reason I'm here, is that we have medicines that are in clinical trials that could prevent the deterioration, that could prevent it going into dementia. So if we can get these medicines to the market, to the public, then all of this will turn around on its head. And more people like your dad, will know what are the symptoms of mild cognitive impairment and will go to the doctor, and the doctor will have something to offer. So all of that starts with, spreading awareness
Right.
of the symptoms and what can be done.
And so what we need to start with from my perspective, your perspective, is something about determining whether or not my assumptions about my memory is legitimate. And so that would be something like a screening, right?
Correct.
Your facility does screenings. Can you tell me why we should do these screenings specifically?
It's very interesting because, as I said earlier, the first thing to go is short-term memory problems. As one retires and you live a kind of routine life, there are less and less things that challenge your learning.
Right.
And I see this a lot with people who are in especially retirement communities, because a lot of stuff is done for you. So you're going on old memories. Typical example, I had a patient who was a CEO of a company. He could run his company. They went on a cruise and he fell apart.
Right.
Because everything is new. So the point is that you can ignore these symptoms for a long time unless we actually test it. And the way we test it is something called memory screening. It's actually a very simple process. We take a good history and we do a very specific cognitive test, what we call a neuropsychological test. So it's a memory test for things that they have never seen or heard before. And the test gives you age-related standards. So for 70 to 75, it should be this. 75 to 80, you should be this. So if you fall below the expected range, that would suggest that there's something going on that we need to be concerned about.
And primarily your memory screenings are a conversation, right? Someone's not walking in and getting a blood test or an amputation or something like that.
It's a clinical evaluation. My staff and I are pretty expert in the symptoms, and they do a paper and pencil test.
Great.
So the whole process takes about half an hour. I don't take the role of their family doctor. We're just there as advisors, and if they allow us to do that, i.e. if they sign a release of information, we can convey that to the doctors. And if they seem like they have early Alzheimer's disease, we can offer them participation in one of the studies we're doing.
Great.
So that gives them a chance to arrest the downslide.
And so just another thing about the screening, I guess, when you talk about a history, for me to walk in to have a conversation with you, what should I know entering your facility about the history? Is it just my personal? Is there a family history? I recently had some genetic testing done where the history was extraordinary, how far they wanted me to sort of root up information.
At this time, there isn't a very strong family or genetic connection that we have found in this field. I mean, there are some genes that put you at greater risk, but they're not very widely prevalent in the population. So what we need most is the story of what's going on in your life. So you need a family member or a friend who can tell you. And so often we have, patients come in with their family members, and the family member, the spouse, the kid, will say things that the patient themselves was not aware. And many people are even embarrassed to tell their spouses that, honey, you're forgetting it. You're not as sharp as before. When it becomes hard to do that.
So it feels like the memory screening is a painless experience for the most part. And we do have the option to share that with our doctor.
Correct.
The goal of the memory screening is to determine whether someone might qualify for a clinical trial of something. And on that note, what are you specifically looking for or not looking for in a person who might come to you? Like, what might make the memory screening superfluous because of some category that removes their ability to be engaged in your process?
Very good. So typically these studies are meant for people between 50 and 85. I don't make up these rules. These are these are trials that are kind of supervised by the FDA, and the criteria are set by the FDA and scientific principles. So it's for people who are between 50 and 85. If you've already been diagnosed with dementia, then it's too far gone. It's for people who are still relatively independent, who can dress themselves, who can converse, who can socialize, go about their life, drive locally, in that early stage. If you're like your mom is in a memory care unit or in a more supervised
Right, exactly.
setting, you probably have lost too much brain power to be helped by this. If you remember, I had said that this toxic amyloid collects in the brain for 10 to 15 years. So depending on how far down you are, the medicine may not be able to help you. So age, the fact of not having dementia, if you've been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, this medicine wouldn't help you. If you've been diagnosed with vascular dementia, this wouldn't help you. If you have, like a very unstable medical condition like heart disease, or cancer or, bad kidney disease, then you probably won't be healthy enough to go through this process. Having said that, the trial process is very medically oriented in a sense. The first part is to make sure that you do have Alzheimer's disease. So there's a full workup, including that the PET scan I talked about, which costs about $4,000, that is offered for free as part of the evaluation. And there are medical evaluations to make sure that you're healthy enough to be in the study and to see what happens to your health over the course of time. So,
and that PET scan for Alzheimer's wouldn't be covered by insurance if someone wanted to do it independently, right? Because there isn't a cure on the back end of that.
Exactly. These tests have been out for many years, but if you and I were running an insurance company, we'd say, what's the point doing it for thousands of people if there's nothing you can do from there?
Right. So why would we expend that money just to have an idea of what kind of slow deterioration? But for you, that PET scan's valuable because you're placing it in context of the clinical trial that you're working with to see the effect of those individual drugs.
And since you brought that up, just last year there was some very exciting news. It's actually a first. This medicine that we're working on, they had a paper at the International Alzheimer's Congress which showed that people who are on the medicine actually showed a clearing out of the amyloid from the brain, which is like, wow.
Yeah, it's really
it's amazing. Right? Yeah. It's for us who are in the field, it's like manna from heaven.
Yeah. But it wouldn't preclude though you needing to do the screening and getting people into trials like even that you still need to diagnose. So you still need to do that process.
To put it in context, the Alzheimer's Association has estimated that we need 50,000 people taking part in trials in the next 5 years to come up with viable cures. We are nowhere near that.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
So we talked before about some of the medicines that are currently on the market. My mother takes 2 different medicines that are prescribed by a neurologist.
Aricept and Namenda.
Exactly. And you talked about that being a symptomatic item. Can you explain what that means a little bit?
Symptomatic cures or symptomatic treatment in medicine means things that alleviate the way you feel but don't actually affect the course of the illness. So if you have cancer and you take a painkiller, it relieves your pain for a little bit, doesn't affect the cancer. So what Aricept and Namenda do is that they improve some symptoms. I call it short-term memory for short term.
Great.
But it doesn't prevent the brain damage and the deterioration of the illness. So it doesn't keep you from forgetting how to dress or forgetting how to brush your teeth or forgetting how to feed yourself. All those things keep going.
And so when someone says it slows down the process, what it's really doing is slowing down the feeling I have about the process that's happening, like the actualization of it.
The jury is still out whether it actually slows the process or just improves symptoms for a little bit. You'll get arguments on both sides, but it's not what we would call disease modifying.
Okay.
It's not a disease modifying treatment.
And from your interest, that's really what you're looking to
That's
do.
what we're looking, that's what everybody wants, right? A disease modifying treatment that keeps you from going down into dementia.
So talk to me a little bit so I come in and I get a screening and it turns out that I have some form of early onset or early Alzheimer's disease. What is going to happen to me next? We talked about a larger scale evaluation, but once that evaluation is complete and it looks like we need to be concerned about this, what is your facility doing?
Right. So I forgot to mention that people who take part in studies need what is called a trial partner.
Oh, great.
or
That's
a
great.
family member
Oh,
or
yeah.
friend who can come with them to give us information about how they're doing. When this is a person with memory problems, so they may forget to show up, or if they have a side effect, they won't tell us. So what do? We talk to the patient and to the trial partner and evaluate their symptoms. Are they staying steady, going down? So they would be part of what is called a clinical trial. A clinical trial is how we get any medicine,
Okay.
whether it's a medicine for diabetes or my cholesterol medicine. They've all been through clinical trials. That's how we get new medicines, and that's how we will get better medicines. So in a trial, typically it's what is called double-blind placebo control,
Okay.
which means, again, the FDA sets these rules that neither the doctor nor the patient know exactly what you're getting. And you could get either the medicine or a dummy pill, what they call a sugar pill or a
Right.
placebo. And the reason for that is because we don't want our own bias and hope to cloud the evaluation of whether it's working or not. So they typically are in this placebo-controlled phase for 2 years, and after 2 years, everybody gets the actual drug.
Okay, all right.
And-
And so during that period of time, that 2 years, you're evaluating the impact on the
Memory,
et cetera,
self-care.
and seeing if the drug is effective. But after the 2 years, everyone gets the drug, and that's certainly a benefit, but it also allows for some measure of overall accountability and see differences in treatment time frame, right?
Yep.
Like the length of treatment. So why is this the path you've decided to take as a person in the medical field? Like as a doctor, why go this route as opposed to sitting in a room and treating individuals who come in for your care?
Well, I started my career in psychiatric research. In fact, I conducted research here at Norristown State Hospital when I was at what is now Drexel, the old Medical College of Pennsylvania.
Right.
So I have a background in academic research, grant-funded research, publishing papers, all that. And I was associate chair at Einstein in Philly. And after a while, I just got tired of seeing the same old, where people come in through the door and we don't have too many treatments for them, and it's the same thing happening again and again. And especially as we spoke about in the Alzheimer's space, all you're doing is watching people go down. I mean, you may give them those two medicines, Aricept and Namenda, but they have very limited effect. So I said, enough is enough. We need to do something to find new medicines. And given my training and background in academic psychiatric research, I was well set to, do this. So I took a big leap of faith, resigned my job, and started Keystone Clinical Studies. We made $0 the first year. It took a lot of intestinal fortitude to do that. So we've been quite successful in bringing new medicines in the last 15 years. So it gives me a sense of, great satisfaction that it's not just treating one person. When you bring out a medicine, it's able to help, millions of people out there.
Right. So where did these medicines come from then? I mean, you guys aren't developing them.
Oh, no,
internally,
no.
right? So where did they come from? How do you learn about this from your perspective? I mean, you talk about 15 years, which means you've been established long enough to access, I guess, reasonable trial medicines. But how do you go about that?
It's a very complicated question. So we are independent.
Right.
We are an independent research site. We are not owned by anybody. We are not beholden to anybody. No pharmaceutical company tells us, hey, give us good results.
Right.
We test the drug, see if it works, and the data goes to the pharmaceutical company that analyzes it. And I have to say, this is a squeaky clean process, because everything we do, everything the pharma does, is audited by the FDA. So having been in the field for a long time, I know the literature, I know the research, what's happening where, what is a new, what we call mechanism of action, what's a new approach, which is the molecule in the brain that is responsible for this, and who's developing medicines for that molecule. So being in the scientific circle and attending scientific meetings, reading the journals, you get to know that. And as I said, there aren't too many people doing this. So we have companies approaching us saying, hey, would you mind looking at our compound? Would you mind looking at this molecule? So given my expertise in the field, I try and pick what I think are viable compounds. There's a lot of, not very sensible projects there too. So I pick the ones that I think make sense, from a brain and neuroscience perspective, and what I think is safe to bring to our community.
Great.
So I triage what's there, and we work with just a few of those molecules that we think stand the best chance and are safest.
Yeah, and for viewers out there watching right now, that's super important to know that there's a measure of credibility in this exploration. When people hear trial, so often they feel a sense of risk, and it just feels like you're making decisions that are both well thought out and reasoned from a very scientific medical background, and that makes a big difference. So again, people are watching this show online. We're on YouTube at the Cisco show, or they're watching it on NASD TV, on our cable station, and they're sitting in the home right now, and next to them is their partner or their parent or grandparent, whatever it may be. And as they sit and watch the show, let's just go one more time and say what should be the red flags for them that they might decide to call the phone number at the bottom of the screen.
So it's short-term memory problems, forgetting things that happened recently, in the last few hours, in the last few minutes, in the last couple of days. So we have a patient whose kids would text and say, Mom, let's meet for dinner. And she wouldn't tell Dad. And they got to the point where they would text the dad instead of the mom because she was forgetting things. Or you have a conversation with someone and you don't tell that to your spouse. Or, example, this husband says, honey, what do you want for dinner? She says, I'll have a salad. He goes down and makes a sandwich because he just forgot what she said.
Right.
You can still
function.
function.
Filled in the gap. Right?
Correct.
Right.
So you can function seemingly well, but you forget recent events. Forgetting conversations, forgetting events, can't keep track of books, movies, stories, getting lost.
Right.
Getting lost in familiar circumstances.
Yeah, and so, what I guess why I re-asked that question is just to sort of touch on the fact that some of that's going to be things that happen ultimately after the moment. So, I ask my wife to make me a salad and she comes back with a sandwich, and then I realize something, as opposed to some immediate response at the TV where I can't remember where I put my keys last night. It's really, and that may be part of it, but it's certainly something that we need to reflect on a little bit to make the decision. And that's interesting to me. Another thing you said I thought was really fascinating was this idea of being in your regular job, being able to do things, and then in a non-traditional environment. And so, people go on vacation and they might see symptomatic events that may cause them to want to look at a screening, as opposed to in the regular daily basis. My mother was in personal care and she was living very successfully. And the nurses there said they were concerned about, her, and she had friends. She communicated with them on a regular basis. She knew when lunch, dinner, and breakfast were. She knew when her activities were.
Running on a track.
She really running on a track. The regularity of those events, and her watch broke. And I noticed the week after her watch broke, her measure of confusion about everything increased.
Wow.
Because that watch was really showing her.
Because she couldn't keep it in her head.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and the watch was really being the. Even though sometimes the watch would be an unclear event, the watch really was a critical component to that regularity. When we moved her to this other portion of the facility, that first couple of weeks we saw a real sort of the reins pulled back on her development because the change was so substantial. And those
new learning again.
Really new learning. And that new learning seems simple, right? Because she wasn't doing substantially different activities. But in fact, it was new experiences that she was needing to digest, and that really what would do it. And that, to me, that's really an interesting component. So, as I'm watching my wife, or as I'm watching a parent or a child's watching me, if they see when new learning comes that I struggle with that, as opposed to, I'm going to know Shakespeare's Hamlet for a while, right? I taught it, for I guess 12 years, 6 times a day. It's lodged in my head. But
it's interesting, when my mom was passing, she could sing hymns from when we went to church as kids up to the 4th stanza.
Right.
But she couldn't remember my wife's name.
Right.
So exactly that.
And so that really helps us. Is there a difference between language memory and visual memory? Is there anything that's a distinguishing there?
I wouldn't put too much money on that.
Great,
because
good.
it all depends on where the stuff goes and accumulates, this amyloid. It is diffusely spread across the brain. So there's no one thing or the other. I just wanted to make a point about the interaction of technology and our life. One of the things I notice with people is that as they're starting to lose it, they're increasingly relying on technology. So they'll put more reminders in their phone for things that they could remember fairly easily, or as some spouses will say, there are post-it notes everywhere. There are calendars everywhere. So the same thing that you could do last year is becoming more difficult. And another hallmark is that people know themselves, a subjective sense of losing your mental acuity.
And so, like a sense of self-identity being disrupted, or
no, not that far. It's just that it's harder for me to do things that I could do easily.
Great.
It's harder to remember things. I have to rely more on technology, or I have to ask my spouse more. Just that, a sense of cognitive slippage.
And we have so much technology today that fills in those gaps. That must be something for you to look for when
it masks.
Right, masks the event. So when someone comes in for a screening for you, and they sit down and you go through that process, has there been any adjustment over the 15 years in how you screen in relationship to things like that?
Well, these kinds of studies for Alzheimer's disease are relatively new.
Okay.
They've the design of these studies keep evolving based on what the field found in previous studies. So right now, this is the state of the art in the last 2 or 3 years. So the scales, the evaluation rating scales and the way things are done is a constant work in progress. So, and we haven't had these kinds of medicines for Alzheimer's. What we have worked on mainly was, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, ADHD, those kinds of illnesses. So,
are there any environmental causes we know of? Anything in our lifestyles that we should avoid or look into? I mean,
well, I'm glad you asked that. First of all, the most important determinant of Alzheimer's disease is age. We are an aging world, an aging population. So the older you get, the greater the risk. But there are some things that we can do, controlling your blood sugar, blood pressure, weight, abdominal girth.
Okay.
All these things help a little bit, and aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise has been shown to slow down the process a little bit. It's not entirely curative, but it helps.
So being active and being healthy, like just sort of taking care of yourself, and what might be health practices that apply to a variety.
Exactly.
Of
What's good for the heart is good for the brain.
That's great. That's really good. So,
but you can't see that as a substitute for, and the other thing is there's no evidence that all these vitamin supplements and all those things will prevent it. There's a lot of stuff that is being marketed but there's no well accepted scientific evidence for that.
So it's really important that people realize that what you're doing in your facility is trying to find something that can really make a difference. And part of that is coming to try and help me get myself straightened out if I'm concerned about myself. But while I'm doing that, I'm also sort of responsible to the larger future of treatment.
Correct.
And so there's sort of two things a person can be doing to sort of make that work out. So we're just about ready to wrap up. Can you briefly talk to me about, again, location, how someone can get a hold of you, or how they can get a hold of the facility to sort of begin the process if something is, tripped in their head during the interview?
Well, call that number.
Right, great.
That's at the bottom of the screen. That's my office. My staff would be very happy to bring them in for a memory screen. We typically keep 1/2 day of the month just for memory screening, but we'll be happy to accommodate people if we have openings. So the first step is to make a call, come over with your family member, spouse, child, whoever can give us information about how you're doing. And then if it looks like you may have significant memory problems, then we can take it to the next level. The most important thing is that it is completely voluntary. You can change your mind anytime, if you think, I don't want to do this, or this is too risky.
And that's fascinating, and certainly we hope people will, at least write down the number so they can work their way through. And again, you're with Keystone
Clinical Studies.
Keystone Clinical Studies, right?
Yep.
And again, the phone number is right here on the screen. I want to thank you so much for your time here today. Is there anything we didn't mention that you think we might want to touch on?
I think we covered a fair amount of territory.
Yeah, it feels pretty good. It feels like a good conversation. So again, Dr. Verghese,
thank you so much
for your
John.
time.
Mm-hmm.
We want to say thank you to Dr. Verghese for coming on the Hank Cisco show today. Again, Hank is under the weather, and there will be a couple of shows where he's not going to be here, and Stan Husky's going to fill in, and I'll be doing some of the events here. We're so thankful for you joining us. And I have no ability to be as charming, funny, or inventive as Hank is at the end of his show. So I'll just say thanks so much for watching, and tune in again. You can see us on YouTube at The Hank Cisco Show, or watch us on NASD TV.
As Hank does. Salud.
Salud.
It's only water.